Hi guys, and welcome to another video. So this is going to be the books that I read in the month of November. I've been reading a ton this year, and it's been really fun to just record these YouTube videos with my reflections and my thoughts, and also getting to talk to people who've also read the same books. I've been reading a lot of books about Singapore, some nonfiction, some fiction, science fiction. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, feel free to hit the subscribe button so that you can stay tuned for more videos. The first book I'm going to be talking about I read with my book club. It's called Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This came out in 2016. And this tells the story of several different characters who are linked or loosely linked together in the aftermath of a global pandemic that wipes out 99% of the population. This is actually the second book that I've read about a global pandemic in my book club this year. Definitely not intentional. I think what's happening is books written on this topic are coming to the forefront now, perhaps, and so maybe they're on our radar more. The main character who kind of starts things off is an actor. And I don't think it's a spoiler to say in the very first few pages he falls dead on stage. He doesn't actually have the flu that's killing everyone. I think he dies of a heart attack. That first event kind of introduces us to various other characters who we will follow throughout the story. We pretty quickly shoot forward to 20 years later to the aftermath and this band of people who have come together to travel throughout a certain geographic area near Michigan. And they call themselves the Traveling Symphony, and they put on plays, and they also put on performances. And their slogan is survival is not enough. And so they kind of embody this viewpoint that we're not just here to ensure the survival of the human race. There are more things that make being human meaningful, like art and music, and that's really important to them to preserve. That's not really, in my opinion, the main point of the book, though. What I got out of this book is a lot more about introspection into our everyday lives. She moves around from past to present, and so we do get to know about characters who have already passed away or who are tangentially related to some of the present day characters. And a lot of her character development of these characters really focuses on kind of just how much we fall into patterns and we don't take control of our own lives. And some of these characters are not very happy, or they fall into this sort of longing or feeling of unfulfillment, or these patterns that are kind of mundane, or they have a lot of unresolved desire. And I think that kind of ties to this idea of, if humanity is wiped out, what do we really want for ourselves as individuals, but also for humans as a race. But anyway, the plot is pretty fun to follow. It's a pretty engaging read. You follow the Traveling Symphony for part of it. You kind of do these flashbacks into different characters' lives. They run into a community that's a little bit odd. They are trying to find some end destination where a larger community has settled. That's kind of like the vague, without giving too much away, the vague contours of the plot. And I did find the plot a bit slow to begin with, but once a couple twists and turns started to happen, I felt more hooked. The writing style is nice. It's not overly flowery or anything, but it's very simplistic and very action and plot driven. Probably my favorite character is this woman named Miranda, and she's the first wife of the actor, and she feels very trapped, I would say, in her life. And so one of her side hobbies or her passion project is developing this series of graphic novels called Station 11, which is where the title of the book comes from. As for the rating, I will give this a 3.8 out of 5. I enjoyed reading it, and it was nice to see kind of a different take on the pandemic theme, I guess. We did have a little bit of a discussion in my book club around how realistic the parameters of the pandemic was, and I think it's pretty unrealistic. I don't think there's anything that will kill 99% of the population so quickly, and the way that the aftermath is described, there's no electricity, no running water, no towns, they're rummaging for food, and that kind of freaked me out a little bit. But as we were discussing, we were thinking that within 20 years, that's probably not realistic. Like, we would have been able to figure out how to resume some of those operations, and there would be enough Costco's around that like we could live off that stuff for a while. I don't know. But that aside, I was mostly super excited because this is the first book that I've checked out from the library here in Singapore. I've been buying way too many books and I'm trying to be more frugal. So I actually went to the library close to me and I reserved it online, and I went to the lockers outside, and I actually don't even have a library card. I just have a QR code in the app, and they scan the QR code, and then I heard the book like go across through the little tunnel, I guess, and drop into my locker, and then I picked it up, and it was a contactless pickup. But I also accidentally bought the large font print, which made it kind of funny to read. But I guess my point is I had really fun checking out this book. I also had fun reading it. The next book I want to talk about is called Eating Chili Crab in the Anthropocene, and it's a series of essays and articles that was edited by Matthew Schneider-Mayerson, and it came out this year. It was published by Ethos Books, which is a local Singaporean publisher. And this book includes several chapters about various topics that are related to nature, animals, and the environment in Singapore. Matthew is an assistant professor of environmental studies at Yale NUS College, and so most of the contributors have some connection to Yale NUS, whether it be some type of academic affiliation or students themselves who have written for this collection. And if you are an idiot like I am, Anthropocene refers to the era that is dominated by humans. So it's the age of like scientific and geological time that we're living in right now. Chili crab, which I'm sure you know, is a very delectable and famous dish of Singapore. I was very excited to read it because I think it's one of the first books that really looks at the environment in Singapore, and I've been reading so much about Singapore, and I know that the government is very aware of the environmental impact of policies and whatnot, but I hadn't really heard kind of the point of view from people who really care about the environment. I'd always heard kind of the arguments within a business context or within an economic context. I would say the main flaw of this collection is that there's really a variety of quality among the various chapters. So I'll share with you guys a couple of the chapters that I thought were really interesting. There are two types of takeaways I think I could get from this book. Number one is just kind of basic information. And then the second would be for it to really like impact me or change my mind. And I feel that for that to happen, it just has to be more heavily researched or more in-depth style of methodology for me to really have that reaction, which is why I wanted to read this, because I thought it would be academic and I thought it would be very meticulous and really go into the weeds. Instead, I kind of feel like overall the caliber of the articles was maybe one level below that. And I'll just give like some silly examples. Like, for example, a lot of the authors quote Straits Times articles, or they very heavily rely on these modern concepts that are very popular now. For example, almost every chapter talks about, you know, Benedict Anderson's idea of imagined communities, the effects of urbanization, colonization, and it just really reminds me of when I was in uni and I was like trying to write my thesis, and you read all this really dense primary source literature or even secondary source literature, and you hear about all these really interesting concepts, And they're very valid concepts, and it's definitely like interesting to think about, but then you just kind of pack it into your thesis without actually taking a step back and thinking about, what do I want to say and what is my point here, and have I actually done any research beyond just learning about these buzzwords or these like heavy academic topics that I think are interesting, and kind of just put them into my essay. So I definitely got university thesis vibes from a lot of these essays. A lot of these articles are a bit preachy without any solutions whatsoever. And I think that just comes with being young, and I'm not gonna like give them too much shit for this, but it's a little bit unsatisfying to just hear these very idealistic and very impassioned pleas from these activists without kind of the firmer foundation of understanding, like, how does the world really work, and given how the world works, what could we actually do to change this? Because I think most people picking up this book already don't think that we're doing enough for climate change, or already think that nature is too manufactured and manicured in Singapore, or already are concerned about the fact that Singaporeans love the otters, but they don't care about birds, and like 1/3 of birds are extinct from before colonization in Singapore. So that's kind of where it fell flat for me. I was expecting something much more academic and much more researched, and something that would really help me understand the true tensions between economic growth and environmental preservation within Singapore, because I think that's a really interesting topic. I think Singapore has tried so hard to intertwine nature into its branding and into the ethos of this country. You can be cynical about it, and I think to a certain extent it's true. It's PR, and calling Singapore a garden city is a nice tourism slogan, but on the other hand, there is a level of intent and execution that the Singapore government, I've come to know the Singapore government for having, that I think is admirable. And if they had the right inputs and the right forces of change kind of trying to make some sort of lobbying effort to the government, I think it could be effective, maybe not 100% effective, but even 10% effective. I do think they're open to consultation. I personally, though, really liked dumpster diving in Semakau, retrieving indigenous histories from Singapore's Waste Island, because I learned a lot about the southern islands of Singapore, Pulau Semakau, Pulau Hantu as well. And what the Singapore government did is they relocated the Orang Laut who are living on that island into HDBs in the 70s. The Orang Laut were like sea people. It means sea people in Malay. And they turned Semakau into a landfill. But the thing about that is, in the US, when you think about landfills, or in India, or like the typical imagination of a landfill is disgusting and dirty and environmental degradation and pollution. But you can actually tour Pulau Semakau, and supposedly it's beautiful, very nice. There's mangroves. There's also wildlife that you can see, and so it's very Singaporean in that even the landfill is like clean and has been repackaged and rebranded as something very positive. This one was a bit up my alley because it was more artistic. It was more about media and art. So this is called An Oily Mirror, 1950s Orang Minyak films as Singaporean petro horror. This is something I didn't know much about, which is how well entrenched petrochemical companies are in Singapore. And when Singapore was moving out of independence, and it was very unclear whether this country would survive, both economically and without the security presence of the British, I think it was Shell was the first company to invest in a facility in Singapore. And so that kind of shows like the narrative of the relationship between Singapore and these petrochemical and oil and gas companies. And then since then, there has been a lot more built out, and they receive incentives from the government, which is not surprising. But this chapter is interesting because It's talking about 2 Malay films during the golden age of Malay cinema that depict an orang minyak, which is this oily man that comes out during the night and like steals women from the kampong or the village and rapes them. And he makes this interesting connection between the subconscious anxiety, perhaps, that the environment and society feels from the presence of oil and gas in Singapore to these films. And that's the kind of analysis that I really like, because it's kind of film analysis, but also ties it to something in the real world, I guess. Overall, I am not sure I would actually recommend this. I think it's a good starting point, and I think just take it with a grain of salt. And if you want to borrow this from me, I would just borrow it and like read the chapters that I mentioned, because some of the chapters are really stretching it and just kind of, I'm not going to give them too much shit, because when I was a uni student, I also wrote like things that were a little questionable, but I never got published into an edited volume. But anyway, I'll give this a 3.5 out of 5. Some of these essays, though, I would give like a 4.5 out of 5, because I thought they were really well researched and had something interesting to say. Saving the best for last. This is one of the best books I've read this year. It's an absolute masterpiece. This is The Underground Railroad, written by Colson Whitehead. It came out in 2016. I immediately bought it. It had a ton of buzz, and then didn't read it till 4 years later. And this is also a book that I accidentally bought the large print version of, but whatever, we're all getting old. This book tells the story of Cora, who is a slave on a cotton plantation in Georgia. I cried a lot reading this, and I think this book is just so powerful, both in the subject matter, but also the artistry of the writing. When I talk about writing in all of my other videos, I think you can basically sum up that I don't like overly flowery writing, but I don't want writing so simplistic that it loses its power. And to me, this is the Platonic ideal of writing. It's just every word counts, and every sentence builds to something or has a purpose. It tells the story of this slave girl as she tries to escape, and one of the key plot devices, I suppose, is the concept of this underground railroad, which in this book is not the historical Underground Railroad, but an actual literal railroad with a train conductor and trains that has been put together by abolitionists and activists to help slaves reach free states and escape slavery. To me, the concept of the Underground Railroad was kind of almost a side point. Colson Whitehead is a master, so of course he uses this metaphor well, and I do like the idea of a literal underground railroad, but it was just it wasn't the strongest part of the book for me. I actually think he could have accomplished most of what he was trying to accomplish in this book without a literal underground railroad. If you didn't think slavery was a crime against humanity before, you will after reading this. I personally think it's written in such a powerful way that it doesn't degrade that experience, by which I mean it's not trauma porn. I don't think to me, it's not like another entry in a long line of books about how terrible slavery is, which I'll talk about later, because I actually don't think there is a long line of books in the mainstream about how terrible slavery is. I'm kind of convinced that this should be required reading in high school. I think is fine. In high schools across America. Middle school even, I think, would be okay. But there's a lot of the use of the N-word, and then also there is some pretty graphic treatment of slaves. Sometimes this cruelty and this brutality is described in as casual a way as the perpetrator does these acts of violence, which I also think is intentional and super powerful from Whitehead. He definitely hits on the theme of intergenerational PTSD, because the story does start out with Cora's grandmother being brought over in the slave ship and being kidnapped. This is a book you can read and be pulled in by the story and be pulled in by the characters. At first, I was a little worried when I first started it, because right off the bat, there's some explicit brutality that's mentioned. I wasn't sure I was going to be able to stomach it, so to speak. This is something personal that maybe I need to work on, but personally, it doesn't take me watching videos of farm factory slaughter to make the connection that I want to be a vegetarian. I'd rather just know that that exists, read about it, feel like there's evidence behind it, and then make the decision. I don't really want to subject myself to super graphic or explicit material, but I don't think that's the case in this novel, and I should be subjected to it. You know what I mean? Like, my comfort level should not be an excuse to not know the truth about the history of my country. But all of that is just to say that I didn't find it unreadable. Like, I felt it very readable. I thought the structure of this book was genius. The way that Whitehead paces how we learn certain things and the point of views that we come across. There are certain things that you'll believe the whole book until you read a different point of view of a different character, and it's so poignant. Like, I'm gonna cry now just thinking about it. Like, it's very impactful the way that he has structured how we learn things and the different characters whose point of view comprise the like different chapters in the book. Cora gets a job at the Natural History Museum, if I'm not mistaken, in South Carolina, where the curator wants to do an exhibit of Africans throughout the ages. And so she is a live museum prop. She and these two other girls take turns being in the different displays. And she doesn't think it's too weird at the beginning, and she's happy to not be on the slave plantation, and I think she's earning a wage, so it's progress, right? But it really hits at the idea of the role of institutions like museums, the media, the press, and how things can be seen as progress and still be extremely effed up. The role of institutionalized racism in our medical system is really well depicted in this book, I think, because there's a couple of examples. One is the forced sterilization of Black women, and the other is the syphilis trials where they're actually just giving Black men syphilis. And so these are instances of history that you can talk about and learn about and read about, but having it depicted in a fictionalized story with characters that you care about and with repercussions in this fictional world just makes it so impactful and powerful. A fascinating chapter about white man's burden, savior complex of this woman named Ethel. I won't spoil it, but it's just like so well done. Like, her dream is to go save the children of Africa. And so when Cora comes to her house, because it's one of the stops on the Underground Railroad, she does not support the Underground Railroad, but she's willing to take care of Cora because it's been her lifelong dream to, you know, be a missionary and save these poor Black children of Africa. There's so much more to be written and said about this book, but maybe one last thing that I'll comment on is really the relationship between slaves and the United States as a nation and a concept and a patriotic entity. Like, there's this whole underlying tension of running in a country that abuses you, you know, trying to find freedom in a country that just views you as labor, that views you as literally property, that will do horrible atrocities to you and just completely strip you of your humanity. Yet this is the country that you've been brought to, or that you've been born in, and that you are a part of. You know what I mean? Like, that and the terrors of slavery and the impact that that has on individuals as well as the nation. And I think that is something that all American children should be taught. And I would also make the case that this type of book should be on reading lists for American children, because having that fictionalized account and having that emotional reaction to something is very strong when you are a young student. I just want to preach on 2 points here, or rant. The first point is actually the teaching of slavery in curriculum in American schools. I think it's probably just extremely varied. I went to a very good public school system. I was part of a very good public school system in Kentucky, and we definitely learned some version of a whitewashed account of slavery. I think to some extent, all accounts of slavery within public school systems is whitewashed because just of the institutions of power and the systems of power. And my memory is shit, so I don't know what I can't remember that well, but I definitely remember learning about the cotton gin. And I definitely remember learning about slave ships and the slave trade. But I don't know that I learned about the history of slavery in the U.S. in the way that I now believe it should be taught, which is some acknowledgement of the crimes against humanity, just the sheer atrocities that occurred under plantation life in the South. And it should be more than just Black History Month when you extend that out. All of the legacy of slavery in our country, from slavery to the carceral state, or whatever slice of the pie you want to look at, the role of racism, not even racism, slavery. There's this show that I watch called Black AF, and every episode is because slavery. Each episode is yes, this is also because slavery. And at the time watching that show, I was this is kind of gimmicky. But in retrospect, I think it's true. We just really don't recognize the legacy of slavery and the horrors of slavery. Not just the horrors, but the actual institutional impact of slavery on every other component of American society. And okay, the second argument I would make is I just remember reading books, fiction, as a child and in middle school, as an adolescent, as a teen, that made me really internalize right and wrong and really formed my opinions around what is something that's unforgivable and really horrible. And to me, it was, when I think back on that, it was mostly about the Holocaust. I remember reading Number the Stars by Louis Lowry, which is an account of a young Jewish girl who has to escape Germany. And then we also read Elie Wiesel, for sure. And I just remember, when I think about, my interior as a child and, the emotions that I felt and, forming things about right and wrong, I just feel like I have a lot of fictional reference points for the Holocaust, but none for slavery. And I don't know if that's a comment on the school system, on my own individual choices, or my bubble that I live in, but all of that is to say, I think this should be on the reading list, required reading. And maybe a lot has changed because it's been 20 years since I've been in school, but I just don't remember reading anything like this as a young person that would make me really internalize and have an emotional connection to something that has happened in history. And the reason I think about that is because I do have that for The Diary of Anne Frank and this Number the Stars book. And so my whole life I've been told by fiction, by school, by media, by the social consciousness, the Holocaust is bad, the Holocaust is bad. And of course, everyone knows slavery is bad, but sometimes I feel that's too easy of a conclusion and a foregone assumption. I don't know if we've really unpacked how slavery was bad in the US, and I think that needs to be done if we're ever going to make forward progress. Okay, that rant aside, I am going to rate this a 5 out of 5. There's definitely flaws to this book. but I don't want to go the whole year and not give someone a perfect score. And this is definitely one of the best books that I've read this year. And I'm going to recommend it to everyone I see. A lot of people have already read it because I'm pretty late to the game, but I really enjoyed it. And I think it's a very meaningful, impactful, and powerful book. I love the writing style, and I loved how he dealt with these really important themes. Okay, thanks for listening, guys. Those are the 3 books that I read in the month of November. I'm taking some time off in December, so I'll have a lot of reading time, so I might have a lengthier video for the month of December. But until then, if you like this video, please hit the like button, and if you want to see more from me, hit subscribe.